Hello and welcome to the Free Speech Nation podcast with me, Andrew Doyle. Today I am delighted to welcome my guest, Andrew Sullivan. Andrew is a political commentator, former editor of The New Republic and author of numerous books, including this one, Out on a Limb, a collection of selected essays from across his career. Hello, Andrew. Thank you for joining me.
Hello, Andrew. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
You've come a long way from East Grinstead. I actually used to live in East Grinstead, and now you're in Massachusetts. Yes, I did. And I noticed that it used to be like a comedy town that people would mention. There's a reference to it in a P.G. Wodehouse book, for instance.
It's also in The Norman Conquest by Alan Ayckbourn. And it's there's a line about a couple that went to have a dirty weekend in Eastbourne, and it was all booked up, so they went to East Grinstead instead, which is a guaranteed laugh. I was so nervous about it that when I went to Oxford, the first thing I did in the union was say, before I say anything else, I have to declare one thing about me. I am from East Grinstead. And of course,
you may as well get it out in the open, you know.
You always put those in front first, you know.
So maybe for people who might not know about your background and what you've achieved, maybe if you can give us a sort of broad overview of your origins, how you got into writing about politics, how you ended up in America. It's quite a lot, but maybe a sort of potted version of that.
You know, I got a classic 11 plus to a grammar school where I studied next to Keir Starmer for 5 years. He was literally in the desk in front of me, Starmer Sullivan, and we fought for about 5 years. Then I got a scholarship to go to Oxford, and then I got a scholarship to go to Harvard to do a graduate degree. And it was there that I got an internship at The New Republic in the summer, and I got interested in all that, and I started writing. It was then a fantastic magazine, probably the best in the country. Very lucky to have that opportunity. Went back, finished my PhD, then went on to work at The New Republic, then was made editor at this insanely young age of 26, did that for 5 years. Then I basically was a freelance writer. I wrote for the Sunday Times, but also launched and spent most of my time campaigning for marriage equality in the early 90s and late 90s when no one else was really prepared to do it. Then in 2000, I started a blog, one of the first political blogs called The Daily Dish that ran for 15 years, became really popular. I took it from various media entities to media entities, The Atlantic, Time, etc. And then in 2015, I kind of had a collapse because I was just exhausted from the internet and I had burned out completely. Took a year off, came back, wrote for New York Magazine, got fired by New York Magazine last summer for not going along with the coverage of the riots last summer and for distant sins I had committed long ago in opening debate on certain difficult issues.
Yes.
So then I landed a substack, which is what I am now, the Weekly Dish. And that's what I put out every week. And I'd love people to subscribe. It's 100,000 now, people getting it every week. And I'm enjoying the freedom and relationship with my old readers that I used to have.
Well, I definitely want to get onto the Substack because so many writers are moving in that direction. And of course, it gives you that editorial freedom. But before we get onto that, it just strikes me from your book that although there is a development in your thought process over the many years, I mean, the first essays are from 1989 in this book and all the way until 2020. But there are consistencies within your worldview. And you've always described yourself, am I right in thinking of as a liberal conservative? Would that be a fair way to put it?
Yes, a small c conservative, a conservative that wants to conserve liberal democracy. I mean, that's the charge. And I wrote my dissertation on Michael Oakeshott, probably the most intelligent conservative thinker of the last century. Got to meet him at the end. I was the second dissertation on Oakeshott ever written. Mm-hmm. It was ignored. But that gave me the framework. And I'm grateful for you seeing that. I'm basically a small government, small c conservative that believes in pragmatic decisions in government, but also suspicious of radical and especially ideological change. And ideological change fermented by mobs is sort of the precise opposite of what I believe in. And so it's been, I was saying that in the 90s, I've said that throughout my career. The big shift was when I used to be a much more enthusiastic interventionist in American foreign policy. Mm-hmm. And the Iraq and Afghanistan wars really talked me out of that.
Yes. But it's interesting to me that you do have this consistency, and yet you seem to alienate so many people on the left and the right. And it seems as though the designations themselves are now just shifting continuously. So it might be that you're difficult to place, oddly enough.
Well, I am difficult to place. And that means that you offend the sensitivities of both tribes. And that's where we are now. We're in a tribal situation in the United States. And I was canceled by the right early in the 2000s for attacking the Iraq War and for attacking the use of torture and for the fiscal craziness of the Bush administration.
Yes.
Attacked by the right, canceled because I supported Obama, but then canceled by the left because I'm not an identitarian. I'm very deeply hostile to critical race theory and social constructionism. I've done my stint in political theory. I know where these ideas come from, and they are truly destructive of a liberal society and an open society. And that's so I'm now cancelled by the left. So
Well, exactly.
it's nice. It's kind of freeing. Neither side wants you.
Yeah.
And so you get to say your own thing without those constraints, which has been a wonderful thing. It always has been for me, but it's wonderful now with Substack that I can do that.
Well, I mean, that's really important. I often feel that those who have this sort of ideological fealty, they're not doing thinking for themselves. This idea that you have to subscribe wholesale to absolutely everything that your team believes in, I think, is some of the most destructive ways of thinking that we are living through at the moment, and is causing so many problems.
Yes, and it's particularly concentrated, unfortunately, because I don't think it's actually that common among ordinary people who are generally speaking much more open-minded about the questions and more pragmatic about it. But it's concentrated in the elite at this point, and especially the media elite, which is it turned so much of American media into simply kind of tedious moral instruction every day about systemic racism, the prevalence and sustaining of white supremacy, an entire revolution in language, ideas, and in liberalism, specifically in the last 5 years.
Can I take you back to an early essay you wrote about gay marriage? And actually, I've been reading you for a long, long time. And actually, this book, Virtually Normal, which I read at university. And, the last chapter, I would think it's towards the end of the book where you really promote this idea of gay marriage. But you're doing it from, essentially, it's a conservative argument, though, isn't it? And apparently you alienated a lot of gay people at the time.
I was picketed by gay people when I was arguing for gay marriage in the 80s and 90s. It was regarded as a heterosexist, patriarchal institution we should dismantle, not join. And a bunch of us were able, I think, to consistently make that argument, and actually had resonance with a lot of ordinary gay people who, if they were lesbians, wanted to secure custody of their children. If they were gay men, particularly during the AIDS crisis, to have the security of a spouse there for you when you were sick. I watched, as I went through that crisis, I watched men being separated from their husbands on their deathbeds, turned out of their apartments, unable to even go to the funeral, the most unbelievably inhumane stuff I witnessed. And I think for a lot of us, watching that gave us a practical reason. And we carried the day. I mean, the mainstream gay groups did not want to do this. They thought it was incredibly counterproductive. They didn't understand it. But we managed to get it through. It took a lot of effort. It took some risks. We nearly lost everything under George W. Bush, but we kept going, and we got there in the end. So yeah.
It's not just to do with legislation. There's been a general attitudinal shift. I would rarely meet someone who opposes gay marriage now. And if they do so, it's usually for religious grounds.
But in that first essay, you can almost hear me saying, I know I sound crazy, but please bear with me. There's a sort of historical irony in the book in the way, because the book starts with the case for gay marriage, but it goes through the calamity of the epidemic. And then we get to the end of gay culture. And now we get to the plague of the alphabet people attempting to deconstruct homosexuality. So it has this weird arc to it.
I find it fascinating. And also the speed with which this all took place. I mean, I remember working as a receptionist while I was studying at university, and saying that I think gay marriage is a no-brainer, and we should have that option. And the person I spoke to laughed and ran across the office to tell someone else, and that wasn't that long ago. And yet now it's just the norm.
I know. Now, why is a good question. And my answer to that question is, why did we do well? Is because we actually engaged in argument.
Yes.
We did not demonize our opponents. We presented ourselves as human beings. We emphasized what we had in common with straight people, not what we didn't have in common. And AIDS, in a terribly ironic way, because it outed essentially hundreds of thousands of gay men across America.
Yeah.
And it wasn't spared in small town America, or the families, the people everywhere who realized the uncle that used to show up at Thanksgiving we never asked about is suddenly dead. Why? People's brothers and sisters and sons and daughters. And that revelation of gay men across the country, along with the sense of our being beleaguered and actually suffering terribly, kind of killed off all these conspiratorial notions of who gay people were. And it also broke the association in the public mind between homosexuals and merely sex. Yes. I mean, sex is part of being homosexual, like it's being part of a heterosexual. But to reduce us entirely to sex acts is to miss our full humanity. And of course, the other thing that happened was, when I'm making that argument, I'm told I'm anti-sex, and then I get all this bilge from the left about being a Puritan, which I am the last person on earth to be a Puritan. So that happened too. It was not pleasant. It was at times incredibly difficult. And to go through that and to fight those battles while my friends were dying too. I mean, Virtually Normal came out the week my best friend died of AIDS. And it was both an exhilarating but also traumatizing period. But without it, I don't think it would happen this quickly.
I think a lot of people accused conservative gay people at the time of effectively, as you say, demonizing sex, demonizing their way of life. I know I've read Larry Kramer talk about this, that he was suggesting the promiscuity might be part of the issue, and I remember reading John Boswell actually talking about how the perception of gay people and the promiscuity in Fire Island and that kind of thing, that straight people look at that and they don't know if that's an ideal or if that's a failure of an ideal. They just don't know. And in a sense, the move towards gay equality, gay marriage, normalizes, says, gay people and straight people, we can be the same. We can be as boring as each other, I suppose.
Yes, there was that famous New Yorker cartoon of one elderly couple in some Upper West Side apartment, and one's reading the paper and says to the other, I see the gays want to get married. And her husband says, haven't they suffered enough? and that was part of the joke, but of course it was too easy a joke. And I was in London. I was challenged at a big public meeting by Peter Tatchell, who told me that he rejected same-sex marriage and rejected everything to do with it. And I responded by simply saying this, with all due respect, you cannot reject gay marriage because it's never been offered to you. You don't have, I am fighting for the choice. If you want to reject it, it's a free country. Go ahead, live whatever life you want. But
that's why it struck me as a no-brainer, because you're not saying everyone has to get married. You're saying just the option should be there.
And also in all of this, lesbians are often ignored, as they are in so many of these debates.
Yeah,
they don't have a problem with sex. They don't, in the sense that we don't have a spasm of lesbian STDs. And they have children many more often than gay men, and they require defense of their basic security. And it was, for a while you went from one state to another. You were the mother of a child in one state and you had no relationship to them in the other. And your car could break down. Things could happen. You could have a medical emergency. Stuff like that was terrifying to live under those conditions.
To what extent do you think that being gay and being a conservative and the perceived contradiction within that has sort of driven you? I mean, I'm thinking about things like when Peter Thiel went to the Republican Party conference, and I think it was The Advocate magazine said Peter Thiel might sleep with other men, but he's not gay, because he supports the wrong side. Is that something that you faced?
Oh my God, yes. I mean, from the beginning, the gay press would always talk about so-and-so said this, but whenever I was mentioned, conservative gay, and someone says this, I was always put into a category as not truly trustworthy and not to be taken as seriously as everyone else. And of course, that's frustrating in a way. On the other hand, I was okay with it because I felt that regular straight people needed to understand that there is a diversity of view among homosexuals, that homosexual men, for example, have been among the most important defenders of our culture. They have been the guardians of standards. They have been incredibly important in our cultural institutions and our universities and teaching professions and maintaining of standards. You know, you see a good musical on Broadway or you see a great high mass at the Vatican, gay men made that happen. You know that happened.
Yeah. Oh, the Vatican is high camp, let's be honest.
Well, yes, it's very high church, high camp, and it's also beautiful. And so my last chapter in Virtue Normal is what are homosexuals for? And I've gotten exhausted with this question of who's against us, who hates us. Can we take yes for an answer and go to the next question, which is not what other oppressions can we find, but what can we give back? What role can we play?
And similarly, with the conflict with conservatism and the perceived conflict between conservatism and homosexuality, there is, of course, the conflict with Catholicism and homosexuality. And how have you reconciled that? Because the Catechism, I'm speaking as a Catholic myself, I know that the Catechism is pretty clear about where the Church stands on same-sex relations.
It absolutely is. And I'm not debating that. There is an essay in the book called Alone Again Naturally, which is about natural law, the argument from natural law for the illicitness of homosexual relations. Rather than call the church homophobic, I tried to reason through the arguments to show where there were problems in them. And I went to Notre Dame and Boston College and made these points. And there should be a more humane way of integrating us into our churches and into the institutions that represent us. That doesn't mean, for example, in the Catholic Church, the sacrament of matrimony can be changed. It can't. Yeah. As Pope Francis just said, don't force changes we can't make.
Yeah.
But the greater openness to gay people, the greater welcome to them, and the less defamation of us, which Francis has definitely inaugurated, even though he hasn't really changed doctrine very much, is a huge, I think, victory for those of us who both recognized that the church has some important truths that have ignored us or have actually presented us as a problem. Into a situation where, in fact, we could be understood to be part of the natural law, that we should be as Aquinas in line with our own nature for reasons we don't fully understand. But God is a mysterious God, and Pied Beauty is my favorite Jared Manley Hopkins poem because it talks about the variety of nature and the variations in nature, and the variations don't have to obliterate the theme. They can actually enlighten it and provide a drop shadow to it that helps explain it. And that's, I think, within the Catholic tradition, how you might begin to see homosexuality. And that's in the book. So that's a thorough attempt to explain it.
In terms of this idea of variety and bringing up something you just touched on before about the notion that the gay community is a diverse community and it has all sorts of political affiliations, religious affiliations, and the rest of it. But as you said before, the battle was won by persuasion, by a process of persuasion, argument, empathy, compassion. And do you see, because I often draw a comparison between that struggle and what's happening now in terms of, say, the trans debate, and routinely now, whenever I try to engage with someone with this discussion about gender identity ideology specifically, the immediate reaction is a kind of knee-jerk, you're hateful, you're transphobic. And I've not met anyone from that side of the debate who is skeptical about gender identity ideology, the kind of gender critical feminist side, who are transphobic. I haven't met I'm not saying there aren't transphobes, because there are, but a lot of these people are just smeared that way and they're never persuaded as a result. And we're getting nowhere, I think, because of that. It's like we're not learning from how the gay battle was won. Do you think my analysis is right there?
Yeah, I think we have unlearned how we were successful. But that has always been a tendency in the movement, in the gay rights movement, to move from integrationist civil respectability politics, as they call it, into this rebellious, subversive, hate everyone else is a bigot.
Yeah.
The way I described it in the 80s was we have to get past a debate in which one side yells perverts and the other side yells bigots, because that doesn't help anyone.
How do we get past that?
I've always thought of myself, and like a lot of other gay people who are in this position, as very in favor of trans rights. And in the United States, trans people were read into the 1964 Civil Rights Act only 2 years ago under Trump.
Yes.
So it's over, basically. It's over, apart from a small few areas of dispute. But instead of taking that as yes for an answer, they want to push it even further to make people have to believe that a trans man is indistinguishable from a regular man, or a trans woman is indistinguishable in every respect from someone born a woman. And I will not say things that I don't believe are true.
Yes.
I would treat every trans person with the dignity and respect they deserve. I'd use whatever pronoun they want, except unless it's completely bonkers, in which I'll just tell them I think it's bonkers. And I've also found that many transgender people, in reality, they don't buy this crap. They just don't. They've lived lives. They know, for example, the gender binary and the sex binary is real. Otherwise, they wouldn't have had a struggle in their entire life.
Exactly. I mean, but this is the concern, isn't it? Is that the thread that I think links all of these various offshoots of what we might call applied postmodernism, the critical race theory, the queer theory, the gender identity ideology. What seems to be the thread is the expectation that people will simply buy into a pseudo reality. That they will have to learn to deny the observable reality before their eyes. And most of us will not be complicit in that. And to smear people as hateful because they won't do so. I think that's quite a disturbing development, isn't it?
It's deeply disturbing. Well, this word hate is also a strange word. I have a piece in the book called What's So Bad About Hate, which was deliberately provocative. And believe it or not, was the cover of the New York Times Magazine in the late 90s. So it's like the atmosphere has changed also dramatically. Some of these pieces were run in mainstream media not so long ago.
Yes, it wouldn't be published now, I don't think.
I don't know, but hate itself is such a crude term for a variety of, let's say, discomfort, hostility, unease, unfamiliarity, ignorance. There are a whole variety of shades in which people might not get someone, especially a transgender person. They never met one before, all of that. Instead, we want to make them all hate them if they don't agree with this ideology, which is a terrible strategy for winning hearts and minds. It seems as if they are much more interested in pursuing heretics than seeking converts. But
also they seem to be blind to their own obvious hateful behavior, when in terms of the way they attack people online, dox people, threaten. There's a lot of violent rhetoric around this kind of activism now. And that is seen as sort of gestures of violence in the name of compassion. It's like the people burning people at the stake in the medieval period who thought they were doing God's work.
It is. And I've noticed that there is also one of the unique features of the particular new movement is its use of vulgarities and expletives in ways that we were very careful to avoid. And as 1 to 11, immediately, the slightest tone. And the way that what that achieves, of course, it puts you on the moral back foot because you're constantly being accused of something you can't defend yourself against. I mean, you can make arguments. You can never say, no, I'm not a racist without sounding like a racist.
Of course,
That's the Kafka trap that they put. Somehow you have to kind of get past that, because once you get past that, the arguments actually don't really work very well for the extreme position on trans identity. And a lot of trans people understand that too. Look, one of the things I object to about the left, the identity left, is that they take communities like the gay community, they misdescribe us and co-opt us, all of us, into a particular position. And then those of us who don't agree with that are then described as not part of the community, as opposed to accepting the fact that, the first thing I discovered when I came out, Andrew, was how many regular, ordinary blokes were in there. I was shocked. I was expecting to see everyone a drag queen and everyone's going to potentially murder me if I go home with them. That was the image I had. I mean, that's long ago before your time. But no, it was a bunch of ordinary, diverse, interesting Americans with all sorts of views. Yeah, they had been alienated by lots of conservative forces for good reason. But were they activists? Were they left ideologues? No, they wanted to get on with their lives. They want to go to the bar. They want to have their boyfriend or their husband. It's just not like that. And yet this small clique had defined us forever. And even now are trying to obliterate our history before Stonewall and rewrite the history of Stonewall as well.
This other thing is this very flippant attitude to history, this kind of revisionist impulse. I mean, I've seen, I've read the historical accounts of what happened at Stonewall, and then you see people talk about how the entire riot was instigated by black trans women. Some of that bears no resemblance to reality.
It doesn't. Well, even the two people they cite weren't there at the time, and we know that. But that's how it happens. I went to a David France movie about Marsha P. Johnson, documentary, and it labeled her on the screen as co-founder of the gay rights movement. And I was at a screening with him, and I said, look, what about the Mattachine Society? What about Frank Kameny? What about the Daughters of Bilitis? What about Harry Hay? What about the people who stood up in the 1950s and 40s and 30s and 20s? And he said, well, this is the truth I want to present.
Right. Now, what do you do with that? I mean, this taps into the now common narrative of lived experience and the idea that we all have different truths, and those truths, the positionality argument, in other words. And I don't know how I mean, one of the things you say in your book is that you say that the thread through all your work has been to look at the world, to make sense of it as best I can, and to tell the truth. We are living, it strikes me, at a time where to tell the truth is perceived as a hostile act if it does not accord with certain ideological values. And if we take a specific example of, because you've been very outspoken about critical race theory, when, for instance, theorists over here will claim that Oxford University is systemically racist, and then when you look at the data and it reveals that actually instances of racism are vanishingly rare, that data is just ignored, or you're accused of being racist for pointing that out. But surely an accusation, I'm not saying systemic racism can't exist, but a suggestion that it does exist should be the beginning of a discussion and an investigation, rather than the end point and working backwards from a preconceived conclusion. How do you break through that is what I'm asking.
Well, it's unfalsifiable in a way, so you can't. You can marshal arguments and data to show that it's incorrect. And I think if you do that consistently and insistently and calmly and carefully, it can, in the long run, break the fever. And that's what this is. This is a moral panic, especially in America. It's so reminiscent of things that have always happened in America, which are these moral panics and revivals that seek out the dangerous people within them and purge them for wrongthink. And from Salem through to the Great Awakening in the 19th century, to the Hollywood blacklist, to the Lavender Scare of the 50s, to McCarthyism. This is deep in American culture, as if we never had an established religion. So everybody makes up their own religion, and it then seeks to police their own religion on other people. And this is, I think, the Great Awakening is a kind of religious movement without God and without salvation. And in that sense, it has a long history in American life. Or, for example, we just had to give you a simple example, we're supposedly living in a white supremacist country over here. Mm-hmm. And by white supremacy, I mean, again, that word has lost so much of its meaning. But the Gallup poll showed that 94% of Americans support interracial marriage. Yes. And in the 60s, that was somewhere in the zeros.
Yeah.
You can look at the number of women graduating college and doing incredibly well in the new economy. And they will still insist that we live in this patriarchy that gives no chance to women. It's almost as if the more inequality we get rid of, the more enraging the small inequalities to the left become. They're sort of engaged in a sort of Martin Luther King Jr. envy. They want to be the generation that they changed everything. Well, sorry, too late. We already did it.
Yeah.
And these little issues you are fixating on are, first of all, trivial in many ways, and secondly, not supported by the data.
Yes.
But, you know, I once said, I want the gay rights movement to do what we did and then shut down, and the rest of, and we can all just get on with our bloody lives, as if
Yes.
that's hard enough, right? It's hard enough. But no, they have to be on these crusades forever, because the crusades are the meaning of their life.
Have you had any luck I mean, it strikes me at the moment that it's less about persuading some of these ideologues than de-radicalizing them at this point. Have you had any luck in terms of, you know, having someone who is so sort of zealous about this stuff, seeing your work and changing their minds, thinking, well, maybe the world is a little bit more complicated than that? No, okay.
Certainly not publicly or personally.
Right.
Like the thing about these mood changes, and I'm beginning to see them, there's some interesting features of anti-wokeness the antibodies are beginning to come out in America. But I think what you do is it's the person listening to that exchange whose mind you change.
So that's the real target, is the spectator. It's not right. Yes, because I've always looked at the view that
when I went to a fundamentalist church to argue for gay marriage, I knew that none of these people are going to have their minds changed. But I also knew that if that were broadcast somewhere, if someone overheard this, they might come more to my position. And I know that it's exhausting to do that continuously, but if you keep doing that, you will break through eventually, if you're right.
And especially on social media, where it is a spectator sport, basically. And, you know, I've always been of the view that arguing with someone who is utterly intransigent is still worth it, because you might end up sowing the seeds of doubt. But with this added thing of people looking on and seeing who has the rational argument, who has the data to support their view, I think you're right. And you've probably broken through more than you think.
I hope so. Well, I get lots of private messages saying, keep going, don't let all these people at New York Times and all these major newspapers and magazines. And I'm like, well, why aren't you doing this? And they're like, well, you can, you know? And so part of me feels like, well, since I can, I should, you know?
Do you never feel exhausted? Do you never feel like I'd rather just not write about, I'd rather not get this kind of adverse attention?
Yes, all the time. It's draining to be constantly assailed as things you're not, and to put up with a real, fusillade of hatred and demonization. And one of the reasons I put out the book is because I felt the best response to these drive-by shootings, as it were, is to say, well, look, you have an issue with me? Here's 62 different essays from 32 years. This is my work. You'll see it is not what they are saying it is, and see that it's a diversity of topics and a similar sensibility throughout. Yes. And I didn't change. You guys went out of your minds.
Yes.
Basically.
No, I think that's right. It puts where you stand on record in a really clear way. And
let's just put it out there. I mean, most younger gay people would think of me as an enemy. Yeah. They have no idea that I was fighting for gay rights in the 1980s, in the 1990s. When no one else was. I was the only openly gay journalist in Washington in 1990. And to regard someone like that as the enemy of the LGBTQRSTUV.XYZ movement is I mean, I'm used to it. I don't really care at this point, but it's grotesque.
Absolutely. I wonder if I could ask you about, I mean, that's the we've been talking about the strategies of how we can break through this, but in terms of politically, I mean, you were very vocal about your opposition to Trump, to the extent that you saw this as an existential crisis for democracy, effectively, that he had to go.
For liberal democracy.
For liberal democracy, and I have to say I breathed a sigh of relief when he didn't win. At the same time, I have a lot of reservations, and I'm very nervous now about I mean, Joe Biden was seen as the anti-woke Democrat candidate, but he is, I'm afraid, worse than anyone could have imagined on this score. And he does strike me as enabling this potential catastrophe, and do some people have a point that maybe to keep Trump in place might have been the safer option?
No, they don't. He's out of his mind.
And why is that?
He's out of his mind. Yeah. I'm sorry, at some level, that's your baseline. If someone is mentally unstable, unhinged, incapable of making rational decisions, unable to read, and also has such a temperament that is explosive, and constantly full of rageful outbursts.
Yeah.
I'm tired. No one like that should be allowed near a position of authority. This isn't Boris. This is a crazy person. And I'm sorry, but I do not apologize in the slightest. He was a disaster. And when I say liberal democracy, exactly, he also fueled the far left. He legitimized a lot of their arguments. He gave them credibility.
This is something I wanted to ask.
He seemed to represent everything they hated. He made their argument that we live in a white supremacy somewhat plausible, given his base and given his rhetoric. And so I also hold him in part responsible, not wholly at all, because the responsibility is theirs alone. But I don't think he was making things better. I really don't.
Yeah.
And I think he made the politics of irrationality and emotion even more powerful than it is.
Well, there is a shared, going back to this idea of individual truths and lived experience. I mean, he certainly has had his own truths which were divorced from reality. And sometimes he would deny something he'd said and you were thinking, but I can just check on YouTube. It's right there. And just, it seems like both sides have this capacity for what they now call gaslighting. And
because they're motivated by tribal victory, not for a political advance for the common good. That basic civic understanding, which both parties used to have. We have our positions, we will fight for them. If we lose, we'll compromise. If we win, great, we'll push them forward. All that kind of to and fro, give and take, has gone. It's now either our tribe wins and we will do anything to stop it, rigging the elections or trying to even block the certification process as the Republicans tried to do this time by force. It's an extraordinary moment. I mean, it failed and it was a bit of a farce, but the intent was clearly dangerous.
But do you take my point that there is something also dangerous about the embracing of identity politics within the Democrat Party and what that could potentially bring? I mean, over here in the UK, I'm very much of the view that the Labour Party embracing identity politics has made it unelectable, or at least that's a large part of it, I feel. I mean, do you share my concern?
The demographics in America are different, of course, than the UK, in which the presence of, again, it's all a question of categories, non-whites, whatever that means, is much greater. And so they think that, my fear is that when these tribal allegiances fuse with race and gender, that then you have much deeper psychological reflexes that make compromise even less possible.
Right.
So I'm very afraid of that. The good news is that minorities are moving to the right in America. The last election showed that Latinos and to some extent Black men in particular moved towards Trump after 4 years of seeing that. And if you look at the new results out of California, you also see Latino men moving rightward towards Republicans because they don't identify as Latinxes or whatever we're supposed to call them.
I saw the survey data on that, and it's something like 4% of Latino people call themselves Latinx. And this is something that's...
supposed to say Latinx, but I say Latinx because it just highlights the absolute absurdity of it.
I don't know how to pronounce it.
Totally absurd, they still continue it. It's like the administration does, the New York Times does, all these institutions do, even though no one uses it.
Well, no one uses womaxon either with the X in woman, and yet this is something. Again, it's a small. You describe them as a clique, a small clique. It's a small group of very powerful people, and I often get the feeling that the reason that they're so powerful is they're quite scary, right? So if they're in an institution, and you daren't put a foot wrong because they're like a dangerous dog, they'll rip your throat out.
Well, they do, and that's why so many people had to leave. Things were getting really rough at New York Magazine for me.
Well, let's talk about that a bit because they fired you essentially because you weren't towing the editorial line. This must be so liberating now. Now you've got your own Substack. It's so popular. You can say exactly what you think. Do you feel like you should have done this before? I mean, you were a pioneer of the blog form anyway.
Well, I did. I did it for 15 years by myself, and I think I got into the habit of saying whatever I wanted to say. And then I had to discover as I went back into the woke media that, that's a little problematic now. Nonetheless, they did publish a lot of my stuff. I mean, I pushed the envelope really far. I thought that I'd be safe as a token, but that wasn't to be. And but again, outside of it, I'm not constrained by that. and I am get three times the money, which is
Right.
the other thing that's driving them out of their minds, is that we've proven our market value. I mean, this is the magazine that nominated me for a Pulitzer the year before they fired me. I'm just that's the paradox here.
When did you first start noticing that there were these, this eye over your shoulder, you know, clutching their pearls at the things you would say?
Well,
When,
the fact checks would come back as if they weren't quite fact checks. They were sort of woke checks. They were
okay.
arguments against me. You can't use this word for that meaning. And just the sense that my editor and editors, who were great, to be honest with you, were under incredible, intense internal pressure
Yeah.
to correct me, to prevent me. They were embarrassed. The staffers were embarrassed by publishing me. They regarded it as literally a hostile work environment to work in an office where I
Work
didn't
with you.
work. No, I wasn't even there. I never went into the office. I worked from home. But nonetheless, publishing my columns created a hostile work environment within the New York office when I'm living in Washington.
So
That was
just
the level.
your general aura, it was a danger. It was toxic to these people.
I was spreading evil toxicity throughout the office, all the way from Washington, D.C. Look, my editors were sane people, but eventually, and my best friend editor who left, and it was after that things went a little awry.
Yes, and this seems to be a problem with so many publications now. I mean, the New York Times being the obvious example, but do you see this as a, how can I put it, a salvageable situation? I mean, it's been called a legitimation crisis. You know, we see that the news outlets aren't telling you the news; they're telling you what to think about the news, and they're continual and misrepresenting, and it's so overt now. And that, of course, gives some kind of credence to when Trump was talking about the fake news and all the ridiculous rhetoric, and that's not a good thing either. You know,
No.
is there a way this can be
Well,
salvaged?
as I say, they did repeal prohibition eventually.
Right.
There are moments when reality just defiantly rears its ugly head. And there are obviously people within the Democratic and liberal camp who understand what's actually happening in the
Mm.
country and are realizing things. And I've noticed that Times actually has begun to adjust a little bit. Even the New Yorker just ran a piece that gave credence, believe it or not, to the possibility that genetics may play a part in human behavior. That's a huge step forward for the New Yorker. I mean, that was a huge, brave concession to reality.
I mean, I sort of share your view on this insofar as every now and then there's a victory, there's a pushback. I'm sensing those antibodies that you're describing, or I get a secret message from someone who's on the woke side saying, actually, I sort of agree with you now. And so I'm seeing more and more of that. But then every time it happens, I just see the identitarian left, whatever you want to call them, the woke left, doubling down, reasserting the fictions that they present as fact. And the problem is they are so powerful that sometimes I just sort of think academia's lost, isn't it? The media's lost. I mean, I honestly go to those sort of lengths, and I'm probably wrong. But I'm not. I mean, let's
You're
take
not
the
entirely wrong, Andrew. I mean, I don't want to sound Pollyannish about this at all. I just I just believe that reality wins in the end. It's just
yeah,
a cost, depends what the cost is in the short term. And I also believe that members of minority groups in particular know
mm,
that some of this stuff is both condescending to them, generalizes about minorities in ways that are not fair or just, and is actually deeply racist.
yeah,
And they are going to eventually move. Now, if they move in any significant way towards the Republicans, then the whole Democratic strategy is fakakta. Look,
yes,
Texas is becoming increasingly Latino, but still very strongly Republican.
yeah,
Uh, and once that breaks up, Latinos are going to be, in 60 years' time, people are going to call them white.
yeah,
It's entirely a process that you see with previous immigrant groups. And I want us to be honest with you, get past the notion of white and non-white and
yeah,
talk about individuals again, talk about the success of entrepreneurs, the success of people that build things, that create things, including African Americans. What you also don't hear is the extraordinary success stories of African Americans. I mean,
yeah,
think, for example, of any demographic group in the world that has as much cultural global power as African Americans.
yeah,
Entire music industry. Everybody wants to be one. Every kid everywhere. It's an incredible achievement. It's up there with the British monarchy in terms of PR. I don't know how they do it, but they do it. And to have that not part of the equation and understanding the United States interaction with African American, not see that America itself, white America, is far blacker than any European country. It's so fused with the genius of African American culture, life, energy, and artistic genius and sports ability, everything. And instead of celebrating this, they want to continue to obsess. And instead also of focusing on the real issues for Black kids, for example, African-American kids in the inner city, that they don't have stable homes, which is the most important thing to do well in life.
Do you think it is the push to introduce critical race theory to kids? Is that what the final straw will be for a lot of people? Once the kids are being told, like, you're telling Black kids they will always be oppressed, they've got no life chances. You're telling white kids they're all complicit in white supremacy. You've had over in America a lot of racial segregation, let's call it that, where there's dividing classrooms up according to race. They had it here at the American school in London, where they were dividing kids up by race for after school activities. So that is, I think there's something about when you target people's kids, then they wake up, maybe. Could that be right?
The school board meetings are aflame across the country, and not just from white parents. Who knows how this works out? I mean, I do think there may be lawsuits in which people will defend themselves against critical race theory using the Civil Rights Act of 1964. You're not allowed to discriminate against white people as well as against Black people.
Yeah.
And generalizing about races and using that as a way to hire and fire people is unconstitutional. It's illegal. And the notion that, well, we have to hire lots now because in the past, white men got it all, to which you're saying, well, so is it payback? And did the younger generation that had nothing to do with this, did they deserve to be punished this way? Is this what it is? And if you do that, how do you ever heal? How do you ever move forward?
So what do you say to people who say to you, yeah, well, all that critical race theory is teaching people about the reality of history and the reality of slavery and the reality of injustice? And why are you trying to stand in the way of that? And of course, that inevitably leads to the accusation of racism.
I'm not. I think the one thing that needs to be done, and that CRT kind of indirectly exposed, is that it's true that the United States has an incredibly dark and wicked history when it comes to race. And it has been overly softened by historians. It has not been fully explored in its horror, even though that has changed over the last 20, 30 years. The question is not that. That is important. It's real, it's dark, it needs to be exposed, understood. The question is whether that is the true meaning of the entire project. Mm-hmm. Whether America itself is in its DNA a slaveocracy and not a democracy. And that worse, this is the argument of the 1619 Project and of critical race theory, that the Constitution itself and the Declaration of Independence are masks. They're deliberately designed to conceal the real agenda, which is the exploitation and immiseration of non-white people. And that's what America means, will always mean, by the way. They don't believe it will ever disappear. That is what's not true. Because America is that, but it is also the country that hundreds of thousands sacrificed their lives to end slavery. It's also the country of the civil rights movement. It's also the country of the overcoming of these ancient prejudices and hatreds. And it is an ongoing story, the story that Obama told, of greater and greater inclusion. And it is also about freedom. It's about freedom of religion, freedom of speech. There are many different things you could say define America. And I do think, yes, race hatred is one of them, absolutely, but not the only one. And if that's your only lens to what happens in America, and that is their only lens, you're wrong. And you are also throwing out so much of the baby with the bathwater.
So you're acknowledging the kernel of truth in what they say, but that effectively something like the 1619 Project is very reductive and presents a very kind of simplistic narrative, which is just as false as those who were lax when it came to teaching about the realities of slavery that came before it.
Yes, it's a massive overcorrection. And it's designed entirely not for intellectual or academic reasons, but for political reasons. The goal is to change the society now by persuading people America is so evil, it can only be dismantled. It cannot be reformed. That's the argument. I'm not exaggerating. That's what it is. Dismantle is what.
And even the fact checkers from the 1619 Project, am I right in thinking they even flagged up that this wasn't historically correct, and yet it won the Pulitzer, right? So you have these institutions that are bolstering the lies, and that's why it feels. That's why sometimes I have a more pessimistic view, because I feel like, if that's the case, if the powerful are bolstering this, how can we possibly push back against it?
Have you ever pushed back against powerful orthodoxies? You nip their heels. You challenge them at every point. You watch certain principles that they have espoused be exposed as false. So much of it is exposed as false. Implicit bias doesn't actually really replicate anywhere you can find it. Trigger warnings turn out they don't actually work. Classes in race consciousness turn out to make people more, not less racist. All these things. And the idea that if you make everyone obsess about race and you tell kids that they can know everything they know about a person by the first impressions, you don't expect that to create racism? Of course it will.
Yes, I mean,
it is much more human to be tribal than to be liberal. Much more human. We are much more likely to do that. That's why it works, I think, because it's with human nature. It gives you sanction to be a racist for moral reasons. What more could you want from life? To get rid of all those ugly impulses and to wrap them in righteousness. And that's it. The other thing, not to get too gloomy with you, but I do think that the role of Christianity culturally played an underappreciated role in defending the rights of the individual as equal, as opposed to the group, because Christianity really created the inviolability of the individual soul, that notion that that's what matters. And liberalism sprung out of that, or drew on that as it emerged. And this is an attempt to end that. And so this is a great fight to fight. And,
well, I think one of the big problems will be about language. I mean, these are people who describe themselves as liberals, but they are anything but. And they talk about things like social justice, anti-racism, things that sound so wonderful. But when you dig down into what they really mean, they are, as you say, making society more racist,
I was once called an LGBTQ person. And I was like, what? Excuse me? How could anyone be such a thing?
So you're lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer.
Yes, which meant I could also be straight. I mean, it's an entirely idiotic attempt to foist an ideological construct into the language. And I don't know about you, but some people do say LGBT sometimes in conversation, but most gay people don't use those contraptions all the time in conversation. It's just too weird.
They don't. But I've got a bit nervous about being in the gay. I mean, I was in Soho the other day and I was walking past some gay pubs, and I started thinking, but if someone were to recognize me and think what I've said is evil and against LGBT, would I be even welcome here anymore? This is the I don't know if you get this, because you live in an area which is predominantly gay, right? Provincetown is is that right, or is that
gay?
Just super gay? There we go. Super gay.
Ridiculously gay. It's but I live in Washington, which isn't quite as gay, but
it's pretty gay.
Look, it's like all government centers. It's more, I don't know, we're attracted to these power centers somehow.
So if you had possibility,
I've had that. I was called the Antichrist. I was attacked in a leather bar. I had drinks thrown at me. I was yelled collaborator at times. I was picketed. My private life was ransacked. Everything was thrown at me. Absolutely everything they could do. But I have to say, but again, it's like thinking left Twitter is the world. If you actually walk into a gay bar as a regular person, especially in a place like this where I've been for 25 years, people know me. They know I'm not this monster that they read about. And most of them are cool and mellow. And I don't have any, and I don't think you should feel in any way bad about going, because lots of people there also will agree with you about certain things. But there is a little creepiness about the imposition of this. I noticed this ghastly thing called the progress flag. Have you seen this thing?
It's an ugly flag with plenty of extra stripes.
It looks like a licorice allsword on acid, is what it does. And But notice that I noticed this year. I don't like the rainbow flag either. It's so lame. But nonetheless, what you've seen in P-Town this year is a lot of the old rainbow flags, but slowly this new flag with the black and brown, and
Yes.
as if they don't understand the rainbow was a metaphor. We weren't actually defending purple gays and green gays and yellow gays. It was a metaphor, for Christ's sake. And now there's a pressure. If you fly the old rainbow flag, is that now a white supremacist flag?
Yeah.
It's what Václav Havel speaks of in the Greengrocer story. It's people put Black Lives Matter in their window, every single window, not one missing, because if it wasn't there, you were obviously a supporter of white supremacy. And this year, I also noticed for the first time a store advertising that it's woman-owned. I'm like, well, why would I buy weed from you because it's woman-owned? Like, what are you trying to say here? Should I not buy things from man-owned? I mean, where does this tribalism end?
Oh, it's where identity politics leads us, to further and further and further division. The progress flag is probably going to end up looking like a Jackson Pollock at some point. Well,
it would be a little bit more aesthetically pleasing if it were.
There is that.
Well, thank you to our sexual orientation. I have to say that flag.
I have to say that you've actually cheered me up with your optimism about the possibility that we could get through this. And I really appreciate you coming on to talk to me, Andrew. I just want to plug your book again because it's fantastic. This is Out on a Limb, collected essays. And like you say, it's the record of what you actually think as opposed to what people claim you think, the ones who haven't read your work.
Just be transparent about it. And I hope more people in Britain pick it up. Because I do think a lot of it is very salient over there. It's also got pieces on Thatcher, on Diana, on Britain, on Boris, and a whole bunch of other stuff.
Before we go, can you just tell us where people can read your Substack?
Yes. Just type in Andrew Sullivan Substack in your Google and you'll come across it. It's called The Weekly Dish. Comes out every Friday. Over 100,000 people now get it in their mailboxes. Please join them. It has a lead column. Then it has every week the strongest dissents against the argument I made in the last column, which I am forced to rebut or respond to or accept. So that's what makes it different. It's a very internally open Substack. It has lots of reader views, also a contest, all the rest of it. It's a fun weekly guide to the week in American and global politics.
Thank you so much for joining me today, Andrew. And thank you for joining us on the Free Speech Nation podcast. If you enjoyed the episode, please do like and subscribe, and I'll see you next week.
Welcome to the GBNews YouTube channel. You can watch us live 24 hours a day, catch up on your favourite shows, and join in the conversation in the comments below.
Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never miss any of our exclusive content.